The shutter snapped closed at 5:56 a.m., and for a moment, Thaddeus Merrow stood perfectly still, his gloved fingers frozen around the exposure slide. A thin veil of frost clung to the brass fittings of the Waverly camera, glinting faintly in the pale light. The tripod's cedar legs creaked beneath the slight shift of his weight, but otherwise the clearing remained unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just the faint sound of his own breath escaping in cloudy ribbons into the cold November air. He blinked hard. Once. Twice. The frost on his eyelashes cracked. His eyes darted from east to west, scanning the ridgelines that bordered the hollow on both sides. The light was wrong. Not soft and singular like any dawn he'd ever known, but doubled, harsh in places, diffused in others. On the eastern slope, the young birches cast long, narrow shadows westward across the frost-covered earth. But directly behind him, the cedars, equally lit, projected their own shadows toward the east. His boots were circled by crisscrossing lines of darkness. He turned, slowly, deliberately. The sky behind him, where the sun had no business being, burned in hues of amber and blood orange, identical to the east. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. "This can't be," he muttered, voice thin with disbelief. His right hand moved to the side of the camera, trembling slightly as he opened the casing and removed the glass plate, now developed and sealed in its dark slide. He held it close, rotating the frame to catch the light. It was there. Not a trick of the eye. Not some reflection or lens flaw. Two suns. Opposing. Fixed on the horizons like mirrors locked in defiance. Merrow's breath caught in his throat. He felt a creeping pressure settle over his shoulders, as though something unseen had drawn near the moment the plate was exposed. The surrounding silence pressed in on him, not peaceful, but expectant. Listening. With slow, deliberate care, he reached into his satchel, retrieving his field log. Ink froze at the tip of his nib as he tried to write, but he forced the words onto the page. Exposure began at 5:52 a.m., ended at 5:56. Shadows did not agree with silence. He stared at the sentence for a long time. Something about it felt wrong, as if he hadn't written it but merely transcribed it, dictated by a presence that stood just outside the edge of knowing. Behind him, frost cracked faintly under shifting weight. He turned sharply, eyes wide, hand reaching instinctively toward the spade on his belt. Nothing. No movement. The clearing was still empty. Still, he felt watched. The clearing sat on a plateau east of Elbridge Hollow, bordered by a burnt-out kiln site half swallowed by brush and disuse. Merrow had hiked out before dawn with Edwin Rath, the local cooper assigned to assist him for the week. But Edwin had lagged behind near the ridgeline, complaining of a dull pressure behind his eyes. "Like the air's folded in on itself," he'd said before sitting down to rest. That was half an hour ago. Now the man was nowhere in sight. Merrow's heart began to race. He scanned the ridgelines again. East, west, still those unnatural suns, holding position like sentinels. He gathered his equipment with hurried hands, carefully slotting the plate into its padded compartment, double-wrapping it in linen. His breath quickened, visible in bursts. The camera resisted as he folded it down, as if reluctant to stop watching. At the edge of the clearing where the trail sloped downward into the forest, he paused. He looked down. His shadow stretched ahead of him, long and narrow, nothing unusual. Then he turned to look behind. Another shadow followed at his heels. But it wasn't his. It stood still as he moved, slightly off, slightly taller, not cast by either sun. He stepped sideways. The figure did not. He blinked, stepped forward, then back. The figure remained. Sweat broke across his back despite the cold. His thoughts spiraled. Perhaps he was overtired, or the frost was playing tricks, or the dual lights had warped depth and shape. But the explanation didn't hold. Shadows obeyed light. This one obeyed something else. His boots crunched as he backed away from the clearing, never turning his back fully on the spot. As the trail curved, the twin lights slipped behind the trees. Darkness returned, but not the kind that came before sunrise. It was deeper now, hungrier. Merrow didn't look back again. He reached the edge of the wood line an hour later, breathless and hoarse from shouting Edwin's name. There was no reply, just a stillness that did not feel empty. Weeks later, the plate was archived at the Braylock Geological Archive, sealed per Merrow's urgent request. Salt-lined linen, triple wrap, classified under magnetically curious exposure. No public viewing. In 1972, a junior archivist reopened the box during inventory and found the log, the glass, and the note. The archivist's resignation letter came 2 weeks later. It read only, "The sun in the west blinked first." But what began that morning did not end in resignation letters. Not when the light kept falling wrong in the valley east of Elbridge Hollow. You're about to hear why this one plate was sealed in a salt-lined crate for 80 years. The second dawn came without warning. Thaddeus Merrow stood alone in the brittle cold of November 17, 1890, the toes of his boots frost-locked to the slope above Stone Fold Rise. A fine mist hung low across the valley, ribboning through pines like a hesitant ghost. He had just uncapped the lens on his quarter-plate Waverly collodion camera, the bellows barely visible in the weak early light. It was 5:52 a.m., and the eastern sun had begun its slow climb, exactly on time. And then came the second light. Not lightning, not the reflection of river ice, but a blooming golden hue on the opposite ridgeline, westward. It swelled across the tree trunks like a breath reversed, casting a shadow of Merrow's own silhouette back toward the sunrise. He froze. No clouds moved, no wind stirred, yet his body now blocked both directions at once. Thaddeus dared not blink. He kept the exposure slide open for the full 4 minutes, holding his breath so as not to disrupt the tripod's stability. His heartbeat knocked like a fist inside his ribs. When the plate was secured and the camera shutter closed, he finally turned his head and saw it. The light in the west mimicked the east precisely. Not in mirror, but in movement. 2 dawns, 2 horizons, 2 sets of shadows, one at his heels, the other at his chest. He turned a slow circle, chilled to his spine. Behind him, down the slope, Edwin Rath, local cooper and his assistant for the day, was still arranging supply crates. "Merrow," Rath's voice rose, uncertain. "You see this?" Merrow couldn't answer. He was staring at his own shadow, long and sharp, stretched out behind him to the west. And yet, when he moved, it didn't, not even a tremble. Back at camp, under the raw canvas shelter, Rath had tried to speak over the silence, but his words fell limp. "It's like the air's holding its breath." Later, he would mumble stranger things. "The sky bled twice," he muttered into his tea, not meeting Merrow's eyes. Once with light. Once with soundlessness. The townspeople of Elbridge Hollow had long whispered about Stone Fold Rise. Old kiln sites, overgrown foundations, and rumors of early settler burials left the area untouched except by the Northern Scrip Company's contract surveyors. Merrow had been assigned here by directive from Braylock headquarters to investigate topographic instability rumored to affect railway gradients. He never believed in ghost stories, but even he couldn't explain what he captured on plate number 44B. His field ledger shows meticulous detail, temperature, wind speed, light level, all normal. The equipment was calibrated. The emulsion was unspoiled. The lens was intact. Yet at 5:56 a.m., the sky had split. The Braylock Ledger of Fieldwork, volume. VI, recovered decades later under a sheet of tin in a collapsed barn, confirmed Merrow's assignment. He was to map soil compression near the kiln's rim for future railbed clearing. What no one had expected was that he would photograph something that should not have been possible. In a separate discovery, a faded margin note in Reverend Amos Wint's parish registry surfaced. The priest, known for his fire and judgment sermons, had scribbled it in pencil beside a list of births. Dawn returned twice this week. God help us. At the time, this was dismissed by scholars as metaphor or madness. But that was before the photograph was re-examined by modern light scholars and declared untouched. Merrow, ever the rationalist, had tried to make sense of it. That same evening, under lamplight in his tent, he drew a crude diagram showing intersecting light angles, lines from both east and west converging on his figure like compass points. He labeled it simply, dual ingress. No known match in natural light. That phrase would appear again decades later in internal annotations at the Braylock Geological Archive, but in 1901, the public explanation arrived in the form of a scathing article in the Journal of Optical Workmanship. The phenomenon captured by Merrow is best explained by a flaw in the lens, perhaps a fracture in the biconvex element or condensation on the inner plate. A curiosity, nothing more. The dismissal stung Merrow more than he let on. He withdrew from active surveying within a year, citing ocular fatigue and a need for light-controlled workspaces. A subtle euphemism, physicians later wrote, for a condition they called light sensitivity of the melancholic kind. He never submitted another field plate. But Rath's condition worsened faster. By spring of 1892, he suffered violent seizures, often triggered by sudden light changes. He claimed to hear distant footsteps in the moments just before sunrise and refused to go outdoors until full daylight had stabilized. One of his final entries in a shop ledger simply reads, "The light keeps time, but it's not our time." The coroner's report that eventually recorded his death, filed under unknown seizure phenomena, would later vanish. The docket page was physically torn from the county record book, leaving a jagged scar where Rath's final notation should have been. It was Reverend Wint again, years later, who mentioned Merrow in a funeral benediction. "Some men chart land," he had said, "but others step briefly into cracks where God did not finish drawing the world." That line stuck, especially for those at the Braylock Archive who reopened the case in the early 20th century, only to find that the chemical analysis of plate number 44B revealed no evidence of lens fracture, frost ghosting, or emulsion contamination. It was pristine, clear, impossible, and yet it had happened. As the lead archivist wrote in the margin of the Braylock Transfer Index, more than the light was wrong that morning. The frost crunched under Merrow's boots as he shifted the cedar tripod half an inch to the left. "Still," Edwin Rath called from behind, his voice muffled beneath a scarf thick with pipe smoke. Merrow didn't answer. His gloved fingers tightened on the brass clasps of the Waverly camera, adjusting the tilt just slightly. He squinted toward the ridgeline. The eastern horizon was glowing orange, but so was the west. That wasn't right. He reached for the exposure slide. "Light's coming fast," Edwin added, stepping forward, his breath clouding the space between them. He was a thick man with a cooper's shoulders and a cooper's patience, limited. "You want me to log the time?" Merrow nodded sharply. "Plate 44B. Begin exposure, 5:52 a.m. Weather clear, windless, 37 degrees click." The slide slid free with a crisp metallic rasp. The camera's eye opened to the dawn, and what it saw wasn't what Merrow expected. The frost-covered slope unfolded ahead, a wide, scooped valley flanked by low stone ridges. But even as the light touched the eastern rocks, casting long shadows westward like it should, he saw it. The western slope lit up too, just as golden, just as bright, and the shadows there pointed east. Merrow felt a chill in his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced down. His own shadow stretched before him, but something was off. It was at his heels. He stepped back. The shadow did not. He moved left. The shadow stayed fixed. like it was no longer tied to him but burned into the ground beneath his boots. "Edwin," Merrow said slowly, not turning. The cooper had gone still, a hand halfway to his jacket pocket. His gaze was locked on the sky. "I see it," Edwin whispered. "There's 2 suns." Merrow pulled the exposure slide shut. 5:56 a.m. The silence afterward was unbearable. No birds, no wind. Just the frost beginning to melt at impossible angles, each droplet catching twin beams of light. It was as if time had split clean down the middle, and they were standing on the fault line. Back at camp, Merrow held the glass plate to the lantern's flame. The image shimmered with clarity. Every branch, every crack in the ridge, sharp as if etched by hand. But the shadows. He counted them again. 1 for each tree. 1 for each ridge. All opposing. None overlapped. He turned to his notebook and scribbled fast, his hand trembling. Saw my own shadow at my heels. It did not move when I did. That night, Edwin refused to sit near the fire. He stayed hunched by the wagon, his back to the valley. "I heard something when the light came up," he murmured, not meeting Merrow's eyes. "Like thunder, but wrong. Like thunder that didn't echo." Merrow tried to dismiss it. Fatigue, nerves, tricks of the air, but he couldn't. Not after developing the plate. The chemical wash showed no inconsistencies. No spots, no streaking, no signs of double exposure or light leaks. Under silver nitrate and open flame, the emulsion reacted cleanly. Perfect, sterile, too perfect. The glass itself was from Port Leod's 218C batch. Merrow had checked the stamp twice. It was standard, trustworthy. The fault wasn't in the tools. It was in the light. Days later, they returned to town. Edwin stopped speaking about what he saw. When asked, he'd shrug and say nothing. But Merrow noticed the way his hands began to twitch, how his eyes darted toward the sky at sunrise, how he avoided the valley entirely on their return route. A month passed, then 2. By spring of 1892, Edwin Rath was found collapsed in his workshop, foam at his mouth, eyes wide open. Coroner's docket listed it as unknown seizure phenomena. The body was buried quietly. No ceremony, no stone. Later, when Merrow returned to collect the paperwork for his own records, the page detailing Edwin's death was gone, torn clean from the county register. He asked the clerk, an old man with poor eyesight and no appetite for trouble. "Must have been misfiled," the clerk said, not looking up. "Or misplaced." Merrow stared at the empty space in the ledger. It hadn't been misplaced. It had been erased. Back at the Braylock archive, he sealed the plate in a linen wrap dusted with salt and wrote nothing more in plate log 44B. But as the box was lowered onto the cold shelf, Merrow found himself whispering what Edwin had said to the shopkeeper before his death, words he hadn't believed then but couldn't forget now. "The sky bled twice," Edwin had told him, his eyes wide and glassy, voice low. "Once with light, once with soundlessness." That phrase would stay with Merrow until his last breath, and those who tried to find the docket later, they found nothing but an empty space. That docket was later torn from the county records. The boot was discovered first. It hung from a splintered branch 30 feet up the maple tree, the worn leather dark with dew, one lace trailing like a limp tongue in the windless air. Elias Quorn looked up at it, breath hitching, the morning silence pressing too heavily around him for such a discovery to feel like coincidence. He'd come alone today. He hadn't told anyone. Not the curator at Stratwood's Observatory, not the archive keepers at Braylock, and certainly not the families of those who had begun whispering the term Stonefold madness behind closed doors. Quorn had no time for madness, only measurements. He stepped back, angling his theodolite upward to document the tree's height, but the lens trembled in his grip. His hands were not usually prone to nerves, not when dissecting light frequencies, not when calculating stellar drift by hand, and certainly not over a boot. but this one had belonged to Harold Sim, his assistant. The young man had vanished just 3 days ago while scouting the Stonefold Rise Basin. It was Harold's notes, half-mad scribbles about shadow parallax and light behaving like a curtain in water, that had urged Quorn to revisit the 1890 exposure once more. Now, here in the moss-covered hollow where Merrow had first planted his cedar tripod, Quorn wasn't sure what unnerved him more, the solitary boot high in the tree, or the fact that the forest around him sounded utterly, impossibly still. Back at the Stratwood lab, under polarized crystal analysis, Quorn had observed the shadows in the photograph terminate at 2 vanishing points, something he had measured precisely and remeasured again. Neither set exceeded 93 degrees from center, and yet the convergence pattern was optically incompatible with Merrow's 58mm lens. No camera, not then nor now, could have generated such dual radiance, each light source casting its own unique angle of shadow across frost-blanketed terrain. It had been Quorn who dug up the Braylock Museum index card, category number 44 B-Delta. The handwriting was terse, the ink uneven. It read simply, Field Inversion, refer to Penumbra Study, Barrett, 1889. That study no longer existed, destroyed in a fire 2 years after publication. Only 1 copy had ever been printed. Quorn had searched the catalog logs. Barrett had theorized that the early morning horizon could act as a refractive prism under rare magnetic resonance. The idea had been dismissed, laughable even. But then again, so was a boot in a tree. Quorn sat on a nearby stone outcrop and opened his notebook. The chill of the granite pressed through his trousers, grounding him. He began sketching the tree, marking the coordinates with trembling precision. A rustle. Behind him. He turned fast, too fast, and nearly lost his balance. Nothing. Just the tree line. Bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward a pale blue sky. He frowned. No birds. Quorn checked the time. 5:48 a.m., sunrise due in 4 minutes. But the slope to his east already shimmered with a faint golden hue. He turned westward instinctively. There, light again. Pale, rising. His jaw clenched. Both horizons glowing. The light grew stronger, more tangible. Not just illumination, presence. He pulled his exposure slide from his satchel, set up his Waverly camera on the tripod, and locked it into place. This would be it. If he was right, if light could fold across temporal seams, then he might just capture it. He glanced down to adjust the aperture. A heartbeat, then a sound like the air being drawn in reverse, a soft implosion, as if silence itself had been cracked open. He looked up, and every shadow on the frost line had split. The maple tree, the stones. Even his own frame cast 2 silhouettes, veering in opposite directions, one toward each sun. Quorn couldn't breathe. His own outline, there and there, neither aligned with his body's true orientation. He reached out to touch one and, "Field inversion," he whispered, barely audible. Then a pressure, low and dense, crawled across the field. Not air, not sound. A sensation, like gravity forgetting its script. He staggered. The shadows bent again, this time jittering, as if reacting to something unseen, something not entirely here. From the tree above, the boot twisted slowly on its lace. He turned and fumbled with the camera, trying to shield his eyes from the intensifying dual glare. His fingers shook. He reached for the exposure lever, and some internal, unseen instinct froze him in place. Don't. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't fear. It was something older, embedded deeper than language, something that knew the price of pulling light from 2 mornings at once. Then it passed. Both suns dimmed, like a shutter sliding across the sky from either end. The forest exhaled again, and Quorn, sweating and breathless, slumped beside his untouched camera. Later, in a telegram dated February 21, 1894, He would write to Professor Lenford Cray of Ardent Institute. I believe the exposure caught a temporal fold, light from two dawns split across frames of matter. Cray would reply with concern, warning Quorn to stay away from the site until a full survey could be arranged. But no one would find Quorn when they arrived. Just his notebook, the camera, and a fresh pair of boot prints beside the maple tree. Harold Sim's name was etched faintly into the inside heel, and as for Harold himself, his boot remained lodged high in the tree. Nothing else was ever recovered. The black plates were the first real rupture, 3 of them, identical in composition and temperature logs, all taken within a week after the dual sunrise exposure, yet not a single grain of light registered on the glass. No ambient glow, no lens flare, no overexposure, just void. Thaddeus Merrow stared at them under lantern light, his gloved hand hovering above the final plate like he was afraid to touch it. His breath, clouded by the early frost that leaked through the cabin walls, trembled in the dark. He whispered once, not as a curse, but a plea. "Why won't it take?" Outside, the wind rattled the loose copper bell nailed above the shed's doorframe. Inside, something far less tangible stirred in the air, a stillness too perfect, too precise, as if time itself was holding its breath. That was when the theories began. The first came from a correspondence with Dr. Milner Gray, an optics specialist from the newly formed Halifax Academy of Engineering. Merrow had sent one of the prints and a copy of his log. Dr. Gray's reply came promptly, filled with enthusiasm and confidence. "Your frost conditions may have caused a lens ghosting effect," he wrote. "Light refracted internally due to thermal tension. Rare, but not impossible." Merrow read the letter twice, then set it aside. He had seen ghosting before. It left halos, flares, not two fully formed suns with accurate linear shadows cast in opposing directions. The plate wasn't confused. It was deliberate. He penciled into his margin notes that evening. Optical theory does not hold. Shadows argue against coincidence. The second theory came not from a letter, but a visit. Samuel Detlow, an archivist in training from the Braylock Geological Office, arrived unannounced in early December. He was polite, meticulous, and brought with him chain-of-custody documents. The archive had taken sudden interest in Merrow's exposure and requested the original negative for preservation. "They're worried about forgery," Detlow admitted as he examined the glass plate by oil lamp, tilting it gently between his fingers. Composite negatives are not unheard of in European geological propaganda. They want to make sure it's not a hoax. Merrow didn't respond. Instead, he stood behind the young man, arms crossed, staring at the flame. "Did you tamper with it?" Detlow asked softly. "No," Merrow said, "and no one else did either." His voice was firm but hollow, as if something had already been taken from him. Detlow left that night with the chain log fully intact, every signature, every date, unbroken from November 17, 1890. The plate had never left Merrow's care until now, but it was the third theory that stopped him. The telegram arrived in February from Professor Lenford Cray at the Ardent Institute, a man of immense reputation in temporal physics, though at the time they called it astral mechanics. His words were not ones Merrow expected to read from a man of science. "I believe the exposure caught a temporal fold, light from two dawns, split across frames of matter." Merrow dropped the telegram the moment he read it. It slid across the floor like it had been burned. The concept was impossible, mad even. But something about it tugged at the memory he'd tried to suppress for weeks. Standing at the ridge, cold breath curling against his collar and seeing two shadows fall from his boots. One behind, one in front. He hadn't moved when the first one shifted. He had moved when the second didn't. Later that spring, a farm boy named Colin from just west of Stonefold Rise brought Merrow a scrap of something found near the frost line, wedged in a cleft of limestone. It was a portion of an old survey topograph, torn at the edges, marked in familiar graphite. Merrow squinted at the faint lines. It showed a ridge, a slope, and something more, an arc traced faintly through the terrain. He traced the line with his finger. Beside it, in nearly illegible script, were 4 words: Sunrise Path, Frost Line Seam. He blinked. That term had never existed before, not in any soil registry or cartographer's guide, and yet the handwriting was his own. A week later, Edwin Rath, the cooper who had accompanied him that morning, was found convulsing in his bed. The doctor recorded unknown seizure phenomena on the docket, but by the time Merrow arrived at the county records to retrieve a copy, the page was gone, torn clean from the logbook, as if Rath's cause of death had never been written at all. Merrow sat alone that night in his cabin, surrounded by his equipment, tripods, plates, exposures, chemicals. He stared at the final 3 black plates again, his eyes wide and dry. They were void, not flawed, and that void had crept in after the sun split. He tried to write a final note for his records, but instead, all he could bring himself to write was Rath's final words, spoken on that frost-bitten slope 2 mornings after the exposure, when Merrow had asked him if he noticed anything strange. Rath had turned, face pale, eyes wet. He opened his mouth, voice barely above a whisper. He said the dawn had a pulse. The crate hissed softly as the salt-dusted linen was peeled back, releasing a stale breath of forgotten air into the temperature-controlled archive room. Elaine Vass didn't flinch. She had handled older, dustier relics. But something about the silence that followed wasn't normal. The hum of the overhead fluorescence seemed to vanish for a heartbeat, as if sound itself stepped aside. Inside the box lay the 1890 Merrow exposure, sealed in a lead-backed frame with a brass plate screwed into its base. The etching read simply, Number 44B, Elbridge Hollow, November, 17, 1890. Aline adjusted her gloves and gently lifted the glass, holding it at eye level beneath the inspection light. Her breath caught. Not because of the 2 suns, those had been mentioned briefly in old inventory sheets, but because she saw something else. Behind her, the archive door creaked slightly. She turned. No one. She looked back at the image. One of the suns, on the western ridge, seemed slightly misaligned compared to the negative she had studied earlier in microform. Its shadow rays bent, not outward, but inward, like they were being pulled. Could be an artifact of the scanner, she whispered, but even her voice felt thin, as though spoken through gauze. She scribbled a note. West shadow field appears curved inward. Cross-check plate log 44B for angle inconsistency. That night, Aline didn't go home. She filed an internal notice requesting the plate be reclassified under Category B5, Anomalous Field Behavior. The last archivist to use that code had done so in 1946, for a compass that spun backwards whenever laid atop certain Civil War maps. 2 days later, Elaine returned with a small stack of other regional plates from the same period, each marked with vague oddities in light exposure. The 1891 image taken by a photographer named Colomar Ruse showed a faint outline of double sun trails across a field of melted snow. The 1902 plate from a logging inspection revealed long diagonal streaks of morning light, though the plate had been logged as an evening exposure. She laid them out side by side, arranging them on a backlit panel. With a trembling hand, she overlaid tracing paper, marking the direction of each shadow line in red ink. Then she paused. Where the lines intersected, just east of Elbridge Hollow, formed an irregular spiral, like the draft of a whirlpool, or the topography of a sinkhole. Not once had any journal, field log, or optical manual described this. Aline swallowed, then reached for the Merrow plate again. She didn't notice the slight dimming of the lights behind her, or the faint static that began to flicker through the panel beneath her hand. By morning, she was gone. The resignation letter arrived exactly 2 weeks later, postmarked from New Hampshire. It contained a single sentence. "The sun in the west blinked first." That was 1972. In the 50 years since, 4 other glass plates surfaced from the region, hidden in trunks, attics, and one behind a chapel organ panel in Greenlee Parish. All shared the same faint echo of Merrow's image: dual light paths etched faintly into snowdrifts, mirrored clouds, even reflected in an iced-over stream. But none matched the clarity of Merrow's exposure, nor did any other contain conflicting shadows across both the X and Y axes, an impossibility under natural light conditions. The shadows in Merrow's image crossed in a narrow band, forming a dim X just below a bent tree whose shape had become as iconic as the photo itself. Yet that tree no longer existed, and no stump remained at the site. Photographic analysts from the Vanross Institute of Temporal Studies took possession of the plate in 1994, storing it in a lead-backed containment vault under 24-hour environmental monitoring. Dr. Julian Frail, a physicist turned archivist, spent his final 5 years attempting to reconstruct the field exposure conditions using digital light modeling. He died of a brain hemorrhage 1 week before publishing his final draft, which was found on his desk under a single post-it. If this was light, it wasn't ours. Others were more careful. The Vanross team now keeps the plate in a sealed negative pressure chamber, monitored by magnetic field variants and microshift detectors. No one has opened the frame since Aline, but someone, an intern, once suggested digitally overlaying the Merrow plate with the other 4. The request was denied. Dr. Halen Orr, current curator of Vanross's B-Class archives, explained it in simple terms during a rare press interview. Imagine you're staring into 2 mirrors that face each other. Now imagine a third one shifts, slightly, just a few degrees. What do you think happens to the reflection between them? The question was rhetorical, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. One question remains. If both suns rose at once, what else woke up between them? What pattern would you see if you overlaid all the plates at once? If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.